We're now going to continue with the Special Committee on SMA Governance Project. The SMA Governance Review stems from the 2021 Spring RA, where delegates referred a resolution to the Board of Directors asking for an external review of structures and processes. The Special Committee on SMA Governance, which comprised of 5 positions, was established 1 year ago at the fall 2021 RA. Committee discussions led to proposed amendments to the SMA bylaws, some of which were brought to the most recent annual general meeting held in May. At a special meeting in June, SMA members clearly expressed a desire for further consultation. Today, we hear an update from the Special Committee on SMA Governance. I would now like to invite Dr. Brian Sharfstein to the stage, and we'll continue on with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if the committee itself could make its way up here, we're not alone. I'm not alone. I have a team. And while they're making their way up here, it's a pleasure to be here. We don't have any card tricks. I left the cards in the room, but we'll hopefully keep it quick and brief and entertaining. We do have a lot of material to cover, and hopefully we'll be able to get through it fairly quickly, but we want to leave as much time as possible for your questions as well. So what we're going to try to do in the next hour is give you a snapshot of what your committee's been doing over the last year and a half, and answer any questions you might have, receive any comments or suggestions, because as much as we're sort of presenting what might be the final report of this committee, it's a work in progress. And given the magnitude of what they've done, it's a multi-year project, I think, in terms of implementation. So there'll be lots of time yet over the next, particularly the next 6 months, to engage before there's some final changes to bylaws, et cetera. But your suggestions are, of course, critical to that success of that. And then we do have the recommendations we'd like you to approve. There are a lot of resolutions. There's 10 or 11 of them. If my math works, in 1 hour, that's about 1 every 5 minutes. So it should keep you engaged, but hopefully still leave time for any questions. And I want to make sure that you're comfortable with what the committee's recommending as we go forward. So even though there's a recommendation being proposed to approve whatever particular aspect of the work they've done, if you have questions or concerns, now is the time to bring those up. I also want to, I guess I should have introduced myself, even though someone said who I was. So I am Brian Sharfstein. I used to work here. I love coming back and I enjoy it. And it's been a pleasure to be here again in person. But I am only doing this as the facilitator of the committee. So what we'll be presenting, and I want to emphasize this, is the consensus opinion of the committee. And we, I think they've had, 17 meetings since you elected them. And through those 17 meetings, there's been some pretty vigorous debate on some of these issues. So we didn't start out with a unanimous opinion on several of the recommendations, but I can say with a fair bit of confidence that we've reached a consensus within the committee. But what I'm presenting are not my suggestions or thoughts, but the consensus of the committee. Before we go any further, I'm going to ask them each to just introduce themselves so you know who they were and who they are, and they'll be also available to answer your questions. So please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hi, Dr. John Marco Pondo. I am the section representative for public health.
Good morning, Namdi Ndobuka. I'm in public health section. I work at Prince Albert's. And I'm happy to be here today. Morning.
Good morning, Lenny Pillay. I'm from Regina. I'm an ear, nose, and throat specialist. And yeah, it was a lot of hard work, Brian. Thank you for keeping us up there. Here to share this with you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Grant Stoneham. I'm an interventional radiologist from Saskatoon, work out of the University Hospital, and I am a section rep from Saskatoon, delegate from Saskatoon.
Thank you. And Dr. Prasad is also a member and was not able to be here. And one of the original members, Dr. Hammond, who's not on the RA anymore, is no longer on the committee, but was with us for about half of the committee's time. So very quickly, you'll recall this committee got together because you asked them to way back in the spring of 2021 with a resolution that said, we think you ought to have a look at your governance processes. Perhaps there's something you could do to make the organization better. And you did emphasize a couple of things in terms of transparency, sort of democracy in action, better engagement with the membership. So there was a bit of a focus to that, but it was a pretty broad recommendation that the board took seriously, considered, presented to the next RA, following which this committee was created with a fairly open mandate to look at governance. So we've introduced the members, and in terms of the mandate, the committee, when it first met, took a pretty broad approach and said, if we're going to start meeting and think about, in particular, how we elect people, our nominating processes, our transparency, perhaps we ought to start from the beginning on the theme that form follows function and see if we can't look at the entire organization and its structure. So they became quite ambitious in terms of the scope of the project, and kept in mind a couple of key items. They said, whatever recommendations we make, we ought to look at the organization from the perspective of saying, is there a way we can make it more efficient, given the scarce resources, particularly time, but also money, and make it more effective in terms of what its objects are. And then keep in mind, though, some of those key issues that were raised with the original resolution in terms of being transparent, improving fairness, accountability, and the idea of the equity, diversity, and inclusion being important. There's really three stages to the work. And the first one, as I say, was a broad overview of the governance structure, form follows function. The second was to look at those specific issues raised by the RA in terms of the election processes and the nominating processes. And then the third has been added more recently in terms of the bylaws amendments that were proposed by the board at the spring RA that were now transferred to this committee to have a look at, to bring back to the next spring RA. As I say, they've been meeting every couple of weeks for quite some time, 17 meetings, and they met with the EDI committee, looked at a lot of legislation, a lot of bylaws, looked at what other organizations are doing. And this is really, I think, the most significant slide of the morning. The committee concluded, I think, at the end of its overview that you're in very good shape. And so they're really about fine tuning rather than rebuilding. And interestingly, and for some of us old timers that have been here a long time, the sense is that with really no significant change to the organizational structure of the SMA, it has withstood 50 years of change, from the introduction of Medicare to before there were health authorities of any kind to 32 of them, then 12, now 1, and a lot of negotiation issues, et cetera. So as you saw, I think yesterday, there's nothing more significant. Everything that you can imagine has happened over the last 50 years to the profession. Yet this organization has stood the test of time. So they really took the approach of saying, well, can we make it better? But I think the most important conclusion was this has been a time-tested organization, and I'll highlight a couple features on the overall structure. And so they proceeded to look at, are there ways to make it better? So-called, as Jim Collins would say, good to great. And I think this was a good example. It's one of my favorite books, by the way, but they really did take the approach that being good might be okay, but not in this environment. Can we make it great? You've had a whole lot of documents sent to you, and I'm going to assume you've read them all cover to cover. You've memorized them, or at least understand the details, because there's too much to go through in detail. We'll try to touch on the highlights only. But I would encourage you to do that, because what I think the committee hopes they're leaving behind is a roadmap to success. And so hopefully there's things in there that we'll be able to reflect on over the next several months or even years. But we'll go through them kind of through the stages that they went through. And the first is just your overall structure. I think that the light that went on for me as we were going through this is understanding the way the organization is set up. And I would have to say to people like Mark Baltzan and Ernie Bergen, who invented the SMA a long time ago, it was quite an effective organization. The key is the representative assembly. What you have is a parliamentary model of governance. There's probably two basic models of governance that you can look at for most not-for-profits. The one you're most familiar with will be the standard corporate governance structure where you have a board of directors, large or small, elected by the membership. And so the membership meets as either, it could be shareholders at a meeting or members at an association, and they elect a board, and the board does the business, and the shareholders meet in the annual meeting once a year. That's the typical structure. This one is a parliamentary model. And you have at the center, the ultimate authority being the assembly, elected, the representative assembly. And then you have from the assembly, a board of directors to manage the affairs in between meetings of the assembly. And the observation of your committee is that's been very effective for a very long time. And we'll point out a couple of the key elements of that. But it is an important, I think it's important to have that in mind when you're thinking of, do we need to change the powers or functions of the board or the RA? And interestingly, as they looked across the country, there are at least 3 other provincial associations that over the last 10 or 20 years have adopted this model when they've studied their own governance structures. So there's been a trend towards this model in some of the other medical associations. In terms of the key findings or recommendations then of the overall governance structure, the bottom line is no significant change. The thought is the representative assembly as it's set up has worked well. A small board of directors has worked well. A couple of committees which will come to reporting to it, and the members being elected from the medical association, staff associations, or the sections. So the first resolution that we'll have is, I'll project here, which is in reference to that master document that we've circulated to you and its observations about the overall governance structure.
Thank you. I'll read Resolution 14. Be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to the SMA overall governance structure, Part A, master document, be approved. With nominator Dr. Nambuka, seconded by Dr. Stoneham. Is there any discussion to this motion? No discussion? Okay, we may need delegates to log back into their Slido apps. And so you have the your login on the back of your name tags if you need to do that, and give you a second. You'll have 30 seconds to vote. And are we able to open the polling while still leaving the resolution up on the screen? Perfect. So we'll open the polling. Polling is open. The polling is now closed. May we see the results? This motion is carried.
Thank you. And that bodes well because it was a fairly significant majority. Some of you will recall our annual meeting bylaw discussion back in the spring, and it didn't go quite as smoothly as this. But thank you. But I do encourage you for questions or comments. We do want to hear them. We will go through now just a few of the specific elements. So having looked at the overall governance structure and the committee feeling very comfortable with that and really no significant changes, there are some changes they are suggesting. And I will try and highlight here just some of the most significant ones. And because they are, I think, fairly significant tweaking, we're introducing them as individual elements just to be sure that first you're aware and also comfortable that this is an appropriate way to go. The first, they looked at the medical staff associations, and you'll recall the bylaw amendments that were presented last spring were presented because of the change that has happened over the last couple of years. So Saskatchewan Health Authority, a single provincial health authority came into being, and the conclusion at the SMA was we need to restructure and reconfigure, or consider it at least, to be sure that we're still effective. And so over the course of a couple of years, we basically recreated the regional medical associations to be the medical staff associations with two key roles, collegiality and advocacy. And to be effective as advocates, the thought was the advocacy at the provincial level with you is very much with the Ministry of Health and the department, but at the Medical Staff Association is with the SHA. So the thought was with the recreation of medical staff associations required some bylaw changes. But as part of this discussion, the question was raised of, do we have the right formula in terms of rep by pop? So you have a modified rep by pop formula. So if you come from a very large MSA, you will be representing as an elected delegate quite a few more members than if you came from a small one. That's to give a strong voice to both the rural and remote and small MSAs, and that's been in place forever. But the formula for rep by pop hasn't changed in probably 40 years. Nobody could remember whether it had ever changed. So it could be 40 years old or 50, but it's been around. And of course, the doctor population has doubled, tripled, quadrupled. So the committee considered arguments for and against changing and is recommending a small change. They're basically adding 4 tiers because the tiers that you have in the bylaws currently stop at 500. If you have more than 500, you get no more reps. The thought was now that we have so many more physicians, it might be reasonable for a small increase. So what the committee concluded, and this is at the end of a lot of vigorous debate, both at the board of directors, at a previous special committee meeting of the RA and the members, as well as within the committee, that adding 4 tiers, which would add the net result would be 2 more delegates from Regina and 3 more delegates from Saskatoon, and no change from the others. And so that was the first recommendation in terms of the rep by pop. Similarly, they looked at sections and again observed that in particular family practice probably has 4 or 5 times the number of members that it had when that formula was first created. They looked at several options and also suggested a mild change to add a number of delegates, about I think a total of 6. So there would be 4 sections that would now have 2 delegates, anesthesia, internal medicine, pediatric, psychiatry, and there would be 3 delegates from family practice. The thought being that 1 representing all of the family practitioners of the province was perhaps a bit too ambitious. So they're recommending a slight change that would add 6 new representatives and those would come from the largest sections. So we have a resolution to that effect.
Resolution 15, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to individual governance elements, Representative Assembly Part B Master Document, be approved. This is motion by Dr. Apondo and seconded by Dr. Pile. Discussion on this motion is open. I have somebody coming up to the microphone here. Microphone 2.
I just wanted to ask a question. I noticed that 0 to 10 has no rep. Don't we want everybody to have a voice? I kind of missed that in the past. What's the rationale for that anyhow?
I didn't catch that, Dave.
I think that he's asking what the representation is for sections that have 0 to 10 rep members.
Very small section.
If you're a section with, if you're a medical staff association, you get 1 rep. If you're a section, you wouldn't have. You need 10 members within a section to have a representative.
Yes, I saw that. And I just wondered what the rationale was because I thought, well, gee, everybody should have a voice, even a small section. So I just was curious why we decided that.
Yeah, I think in terms of trying to be representative and fair, that is definitely a consideration. But to form a section, you need to have a minimum of at least 10 members. So I think there's a little bit of redundancy there. So to actually be a formal section, you need to be 10 plus, and you would have representation at the RA.
It is a point we should take under consideration, I think, too. And when we get to the end, and I'll mention it now, though, these recommendations will be going to the Legislative and Policy Committee. And they're going to spend the next 6 months making it happen, so to speak, along with the Board of Directors. And there will be important input. For example, that the committee's recommending that formula. I would point out, in terms of the sections, that is a focus of the EDI issues. Sections historically have been the traditional variations within the organization in terms of practice. So the various specialties within medicine are sections, but we have retired physicians, we have addiction medicine, sports medicine. It could be left-handed Jaguar drivers. So if the idea is that sections are the way we can enhance diversity. And if there are a group of physicians, international medical graduates, whatever, that feel that they would like better representation and acknowledgement and participation within the association, they can form a section, apply to the board to be recognized as a section, and that's the way they would get a voice in your parliament. So it is a very important component to the EDI issues, and one that the committee thought needs to be preserved. That would then, of course, historically, there really haven't been sections with less than 10 that seem to worry about needing to be represented. Potentially there might be, and those might have to be revisited.
Is there any other further discussion from the floor? Shall we call the vote? Okay, I'll have the polling open, please. Delegates, please open your Slido browser. You'll have 30 seconds to vote, and polling opens now. Polling is closed. May we see the results? This motion is carried.
Thank you. The next topic, just to spend a minute or two on, is the idea of the annual general meeting. One might think that's a pretty boring subject, but I would say one of our spiciest debates was on the pros and cons and merits of an annual general meeting. And recall that I highlighted to you the difference in your models. So the annual general meeting is paramount in the standard governance model, the corporate model, where you have a board of directors and you don't have a parliament. And the only way you influence effectively the board of directors is at your annual meeting and voting. In the parliamentary model, it's quite different. So you have the ultimate authority being the representative assembly, not the board of directors, and they're elected from their home constituencies, and then from the RA, the board is elected. So it does diminish to some extent the need for or the value of the annual general meeting. And over time, that's what you've seen with the RA. So very frequently, the AGM is a perfunctory, we got to get it done, get the business over with. It's usually held in conjunction with an RA. Otherwise, there may be nobody at the meeting. But so the discussion was, do we need one at all? And the original committee recommendation was to perhaps do away with it and instead replace it with functional representative members forum, encourage members to participate because the committee was very keen on improving engagement for all members, not just elected delegates, and making this a meeting where members felt they were welcome and could bring issues. After the special meetings and a lot more discussion, the conclusion of the committee was it still has merit, partly perceptually, but also functionally. So first, there's a perception that we have an annual meeting. That's the members' chance to get together and say what they think and ask the questions they want. And it was worth preserving, whether it remains perfunctory or becomes more substantive. So at the end of those discussions, the committee is recommending that we retain the annual general meeting with its authority, which is relatively limited because the RA has the ultimate authority, but it is the body that approves bylaws. So it would continue to be the place where bylaws need to come for final approval. It also receives the financial statements, and there's been discussion, do they approve them or not? The financial statements are a statement of fact. Whether you like them or not is different. You can comment on them, but they are what they are, so they receive them. The RA approves the budget, not the AGM. But the AGM has the ability to make recommendations, pass resolutions, which would go either directed to the board or the RA. In addition, though, the committee talked a lot about enhancing the idea of the AGM, which is member engagement. So they have a whole document that Ivan and his team were very helpful in assisting with in terms of an engagement plan to improve member participation. And that would be a recommendation to the board and the LPC that in addition to the standard AGM, they continue to encourage member participation outside of the RA delegates. So we have a resolution to present in that regard. And as I say, it's to essentially preserve the existing AGM with a recommendation to enhance member participation at both representative assembly meetings.
Resolution 16, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to individual governance elements, AGM Part B Master Document, be approved. And this is moved by Dr. Pillay and seconded by Dr. Apondo. Is there any discussion to this motion? Seeing no one, we will call the vote. Please vote on your Slido app. We'll have the polling open. Polling is open. The polling is closed. May we see the results? This motion is carried.
Thank you. And given your enthusiasm for that resolution, I assume you'll all be at the next AGM and participate vigorously. So that's good news. Board of Directors, once again, the committee thinks it's been very functional as a small board with significant diversity and is not recommending any significant change in that regard. They do, however, want to make one specific recommendation to go from a one-year term to a two-year term. The committee's conclusion was that it takes you a year to get your feet wet, so to speak. And if you're coming on the board, it ought to be with the thought that it would be at a minimum a 2-year term. So they're recommending changing the bylaws to a 2-year term and also putting in a maximum. Currently, the bylaws do not have a maximum, so you could theoretically serve as a board of director member for 10 or 20 years or more. And they thought there should be turnover required, not just optional. Now, historically, there always has been. There's sort of a pattern that's evolved over years where people come on, they stay for 3, 4, 5 years and go off is often common. Some will come for a year and go, et cetera. But they thought 2 years minimum, maximum of 3, unless you move on to the elected officer positions, then you'd finish through that progression. And they thought we should retain the officers as we do. There's a lot of discussions, not many, but some other organizations have a president-elect and a president. The merits of that were debated at some length. And the conclusion was it's worked well here with a honorary treasurer, vice president, president, past president, moving 1 year to the next and expecting to move 1 year to the next, but occasionally not. And that option is also thought to be desirable. So the main change that they're recommending is a 2-year term maximum of 3, but they would continue to be elected from the RA. And that was an important point. The committee felt quite strongly that the double filter, so to speak, that to be a member of the board of directors of the SMA, you must first get elected at home. So your folks back home need to elect you, and they know you, and they are probably best positioned to make that decision. So the first test is to be a member of the board. You need to be elected as a member of either your section, or from your medical staff association. Then to be elected to the board, you need to be at the RA, and the people in this room have the wisdom, having seen you at the RA functioning in that environment, of making a decision as would you make an effective board member. And the thought was that was a very effective way to elect your leaders. There are in some divisions, the president is elected by the membership at large. The conclusion that the committee made was that this probably is the more effective and functional, and again, has stood the test of time generally. So they're not suggesting any change to that part of the election process. And again, if there are any questions or uncertainty, please jump up and I'd encourage you to do that. But we have a resolution in regard to the board of directors.
Resolution 17, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to individual governance elements, Board of Directors Part B Master Document be approved. And this is moved by Dr. Ndebuka and seconded by Dr. Pile. Any discussion on this motion? All right, we will call the vote. Delegates, please vote on your Slido app. Polling is open. Can we open the polling? I don't have my timer going yet. There we go. Polling is now open. Polling is now closed. May we see the results? That motion is carried.
Thank you. Next, there are 2 committees currently, well, there are 3, but 2 specifically named in the bylaws. Most of the committees of the SMA are committees of the board, and the board can do with them as they wish. So they appoint a committee or they don't, create a new committee if they want. But there are 2 that are required in bylaws because they're deemed to be more important, more significant. The first is finance. Tough to run an organization without money. So it's always pretty important in either governance model. The committee was quite comfortable with the current arrangement of the Finance Committee in terms of its scope and its mandate, but did suggest a change. They thought that the Finance Committee, rather than being just a committee of the board, should be a joint committee of the RA and the board. So you would take a higher degree of ownership for that committee, both in terms of its membership, and it currently does report to the RA as well as the board. So they're suggesting a change where 2 members of finance would be elected by the RA, and then the board would appoint 2 ordinary members who are not currently board or RA members to the committee. The members would have 2-year terms as well, with maximum of 3, and that's a consistent recommendation within bylaws that they're making. And the chair will be appointed by the board from among the Finance Committee members. And then it would also include the honorary treasurer ex officio. So there'd be 5 on the committee, and its mandate would remain as it currently is. And they think it should remain in bylaws as an important committee. So we do have a resolution regarding finance.
Resolution 18, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to individual governance elements, Finance Committee, Part B Master Document, be approved. And this is moved by Dr. Stoneham and seconded by Dr. Pillay. Any discussion on this motion? Microphone
Hi.
number 2, please.
Yeah, Mark Brown, delegate from Moose Jaw and past president. Yeah, I'm just trying to get my head around the way the Finance Committee is going to be elected by the board as well as the RA. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the representative assembly, how much insight they have into the actual, finances. Yes, we do see we do see the financial documents and statements, but is this something that maybe the board has a lot more insight into the finances of the SMA? I'm just trying to, this is the first time I've seen this, so I'm just trying to kind of think through it logically and kind of question whether that's wise or not. So maybe if some of the committee members can just talk a little bit to that, I can be convinced that it's the right way to go, rather than allowing the board to appoint the Finance Committee and for the Finance Committee to stay solely a committee that reports to the board. We're giving the board like 2-year terms, which is essentially, I think, a good thing. It's more stability, but then you're also taking away some of the board's power in terms of governance. So it seems to be the one step is a good one. The previous motion and this one, I'm not so sure of. I'm not opposed to it. I just would like to understand a little bit more the rationale.
Grant, did you?
Sure, I can try and give some context for that. We thought that the RA should have more input into the various committees. When you look further through the documents, you'll see that the Appointments and Nomination Committee actually look at competencies, and they look at a framework to try and get representation on the committees. So there is the people that would self-identify to be on a committee like that may be picked out through that process. So we actually did think it was important to have the RA involved in that. The board also is definitely involved because it has 2 positions as well, but it's a balance between board and RA approach. We do think that it's important to have people on for a designated term, but and at least 2 years to start off with. People learn on the job, of course, but so it's important to have them there for a period of time, but then also limited to the total of 3 terms. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks, Grant. One other thing I'd point out, we did, and we're going to come to that shortly in terms of, I think the thrust of your question is how are we going to make sure we got the best people on these committees? And this is more about accountability. We think the Finance Committee is accountable to the RA, and it should have some role then both in reporting and maybe electing them. But you'll see when we go through the election process and the attributes matrix, the idea is the RA will elect couple of folks, then the board will appoint subsequently. And they'll use a matrix to have the expertise they're required, so they can sort of fill in the blanks, so to speak, to have the expertise that they want. So some of the question you've asked will be answered, I think, a bit too when we highlight the way that we envisage nomination election to occur. But an important point to your question is the board will appoint subsequent to the RA election to try to add whatever competencies they see are missing from the committee, if there are some.
Microphone 3, please.
Dr. Sridhar, I'm an observer, so can I have the
Please.
permission? Yeah. The finances of any organization, who has the best knowledge? The best knowledge resides with the board. So in the board itself has the responsibility to the RA. So there is an accountability that exists, line of sight exists. So in certain settings, it may be worthwhile to even consider the finance committee and the approval of the budget and the authority should reside with the board, and the board could come back to the RA for its approval and so forth, whatever the process may be. So you have to think through that. So to expand Dr. Mark Brown's point is very valid, is there is a disconnect, or what is the RA role and what is the board's role? We need to figure that out, and it need to be thought through a little bit more carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any more discussion from the floor?
Sorry, can I just comment on that? Thanks, Dr. Sridhar. You know, if you look back at our recommendations, the committee's recommendations, the honorary treasurer does come from the board. So you will have feedback in that way from the board. And then the other members, as Dr. Stoneham points out, is that with the matrix, hopefully with the 2-year terms, as people learn on the job, as we would say, they can take that feedback to the board. The finance committee meets with the board, and there will be that push-pull mechanism where you will have accountability on both sides. I hope that clarifies it.
Any other discussion? Shall we call the question? Please vote on your Slido browser and we'll open the polling. Polling is now open. The polling is closed. May we see the results? This motion is carried. I was just going to get a point of clarification. I do think that when we have committee members that are seconders on the motion, that they should be in the timed space as well when they're responding, even if they're up on the stage. Yes, okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you. The other committee that's specifically referenced in bylaws is the nominating committee. And this really leads a bit to stage 2 of the work, which was thinking about how the RA elects its leaders, how the organization chooses its leaders, appoints its committee members, et cetera. And they are making some fairly significant suggested changes. Currently, what you have is a nominating committee of the RA, which focuses exclusively on nominating, putting forward a slate for you of the positions you elect at the RA. At the same time, the board has a committee, appointments and awards, which advises it and makes recommendations to the board on the appointment in all the other committees. A fair bit of overlap. The committee's thought was those two should be combined into one committee where we can harness the expertise and develop the expertise and the processes to be as efficient and effective as possible doing that. So they're recommending combining those two committees to a single committee, the Nomination and Appointments Committee. And then they have a number of recommendations in regard to the actual work of the committee and how it will do its job, which we'll come to. So this would be a joint committee. There would be 3 members elected from the RA, and then there would be as well 2 ordinary members appointed by the board, committee of 5. The past president would be ex officio, given their historical knowledge of the organization. And they would be ex officio, non-voting, and they would chair the NNA committee is the recommendation. 2-year term, maximum 3. And it would then report to the board and assist the board in doing its appointments for its committees. But it would also, of course, report to the RA and bring forward the slate of nominees for the various positions you elect, including the 2 new now finance committee. And we'll go into a little more detail in a minute of the processes they are suggesting that you would use. The mandate as well is expanded a bit in terms of it being a little more ambitious committee, not just meeting occasionally before the RA to find some willing people to serve in committees, but really working through the year to cultivate and encourage members to be willing and interested to serve either on committees or elected positions. So a fairly expanded mandate, which you've seen in the terms of reference that were sent in the documents. So we have a resolution for that committee as well.
Resolution 19, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Governance Committee on SMA governance pertaining to individual governance elements, nominating committee, Part B master document be approved. And this is moved by Dr. Apondo and seconded by Dr. Ndebuka. And we have some discussion from the floor. Microphone 3, please.
Good morning. I'm Barb Konstantinovich. I'm a delegate. I see that you've got 2 ordinary members. As you had mentioned earlier, the community with which you reside decides if you are a trustworthy leader and a delegate to the RA. As such, I believe that this committee, which houses a tremendous amount of power in our organization, should only have delegates as opposed to ordinary members. Those 2 ordinary members picked by the board do not fit in a democratic position in this committee. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Konstantinovich. I think you're right. This is a very important process and committee because these are the folks who help the SMA board and the RA to really present good candidates in front of us. I think the sense was trying to be more open and democratic, but I think I'm also hearing there's already been elected representation through the RA process. I'm not sure if I can say what the final word will be on where this lands, but this was part of that whole transparency and trying to make sure we are at each step trying to get real member participation from the grassroots right through the RA, right to the board level. But you're right. I think an important committee, but the day-to-day, governance still will come to the board. The board does make a lot of those decisions on who then goes forward.
Is there other discussion from the floor? Dr. Stoneham?
Yeah, so the ordinary members appointed by the board, the ownership of that appointment is the board. So they can appoint whoever they want. And historically, they've actually chosen people that have previously been on the board. So the nominations committee often was ex-presidents and actually almost entirely ex-residents in the past. So it's up to the board to decide who they want to appoint to that. And it's not prescriptive. You don't have to appoint someone who's not a board, hasn't previously been on the board. So it's open to the board's discretion for that particular appointment.
Okay, is there any further discussion from the floor?
I can just add as well.
Please.
Thank you. And I think the idea of, just add to my colleague's comment, in trying to be more transparent and not just lock down some of these committee positions to the RA, and also a way to encourage membership engagement at grassroots level. I think we said that this might be an opportunity for the board to use its usual process of calling on members to express interest in this particular positions. And then, of course, we go through the same process of identifying if they're eligible and if they've got the skill set and competence to serve in these positions. That's the reason why we said that this might be of value. But again, these are just recommendations, and we're still up for further discussion. Thanks.
We have microphone 3,
May I reply?
please.
This is a powerful committee. If you want engagement, engagement can certainly be in other and possibly less powerful committees. Thank you.
Is there any more discussion from the floor? Shall we call the question? Call the motion? I'll have the polling open. Polling is open. Polling is closed. May we see the results? That motion is defeated. Do we have, is it 66%, Rishi, 2/3?
No.
Is it just majority? Okay, that motion is carried.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's, okay. Is it saving?
Almost defeated. And I think a good point made in terms of, and we'll come to that in terms of the balance of competencies versus representation and diversity in your committees. And as was observed, 2 very important committees, finance and nominating. And how do you have the proper balance? The next is you've been circulated the terms of reference, and I've already highlighted the expanded mandate, and there'll be more detail. So we'll just move right on to the resolution in regard to the terms of reference for the new nominating and nomination and appointments committee.
Resolution 20, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to the draft terms of reference for the Nomination and Appointments Committee, Document 2, be approved. And this is moved by Dr. Ndabuka and Dr. Stoneham. I'd like to open up discussion for this motion. With no discussion seen, let's call the question. Have the polling open, please. Polling is open. The polling is closed. May we see the results? This motion is carried.
Thank you. That's the end of the overall governance piece. This would be on the basis of the recommendations of the committee, your new governance structure. For those of you who were awake at the start of this session, that looks a lot like the slide we started with for good reason. some minor changes in terms of reporting relationships, terms, a few extra delegates, et cetera. So stage two, and the second part of their work was essentially your concern about is the process by which we encourage leaders to come forward, find representatives and leaders within the organization, nominate them, elect them as transparent and open and fair and democratic as they ought to be. And the question was raised, and the committee spent a lot of time looking at that and came forward with a document that is worth going through at your leisure, the details, but they've outlined in a fair bit of detail the process that they would recommend the nominating and appointment committee would use to encourage and foster the leadership to come forward to the elected positions and to assist the committee in finding those delegates. It basically consists of 7 steps. I would emphasize the first one. The idea is that we ought to do a lot more to encourage our members to participate. Most of you are volunteers. Unlike like myself, you probably became accidental leaders. But the thought was that there's a fair bit that could be done throughout the year by the committee to encourage participation by members, encourage them to come forward and volunteer. They very much continue to support the idea of this being a volunteer organization that lives and breathes and succeeds on the basis of that spirit, but it needs to be fostered and encouraged. So that's a major aspect of the work of the committee, not just finding a few people to come forward a week before the RA, so to speak. So they would spend time identifying, first they would identify the positions that would be coming up for election in particular. They would then passively recruit. The chair of the committee would send emails to all of the potential nominees, encouraging them to come forward and self-nominate. So it's a self-nomination, expression of interest. They would ask for a basic amount of information so that when you do vote for these delegates, you know a bit about them. So the idea is to have a fairly consistent protocol so that you would see in advance, so you would know the delegates that you are going to be voting for the various positions. They would then take that slate of volunteers, so to speak, that have willing to be nominated and go through them and apply a grid, a so-called attribute matrix. They would see if there's any vacancies or areas that they think are not properly represented. And if so, they would then undertake a bit more active recruitment. This was a fairly spirited discussion in terms of the concern about discouraging the old boys club, so to speak, the shoulder tapping idea that it might be too easy to just be a small group of people who is in charge of the bus and manages to maintain that. They did, however, recognize that sometimes folks are a little reluctant, excellent candidates, and there are many of you in the room reluctant to come forward, but if encouraged a bit would. And certainly in my history in this organization, many of our very best leaders came forward because they were prompted or encouraged to do that. So it was thought it's important to do that, but in an open, transparent, clear way. So the so-called active recruitment, if there aren't sufficient candidates to fill the vacancies or the right skill set. And then finally, the committee would actually meet and apply a grid that we'll look at in a minute to assess the candidates. And the committee would bring forward to you, as they have historically, a suggested candidate for each position, not the whole slate. So if there were 5 candidates for a position that were interested, they would look through the committee structure currently, the balance, the mix, and bring forward a recommended name. That would still allow at the RA for nominations from the floor and for other interested candidates to come forward. And they would also be expected to provide a little background information so you'd know about them as well. That's a snapshot. It's much more detailed document in your package that if you haven't looked at it in any detail, I'd encourage you to. And then this will be a proposed recommendation that would go to the board and the ledge committee to look at implementing in terms of the policies and procedures the nominating and appointments committee would use. So we have a resolution in regard to that proposal.
So resolution 21, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to the proposed process for nomination and election of RA elected positions, document 3, be approved. And this is moved by Dr. Stoneham and seconded by Dr. Ndebuka. Is there discussion on this motion? Seeing no discussion, we will call the question. Can we have the polling open, please? The polling is open. Polling is now closed. May we see the results? That motion is carried.
Thank you. One comment before we move to the attribute matrix. The committee also observed that this process that they're suggesting could be mirrored to some extent within the medical staff associations. And so I would encourage all of you who are obviously leaders within your own medical staff associations back home to think about that and take this and because we've heard that there's the same angst and worry. First, the same challenge, a shortage of volunteers. Who's willing to do this work? So some of the ideas and processes to encourage members to participate, but also the same question of, do we have an efficient, open, fair, transparent process within our own medical staff associations to nominate and elect our leaders? And the committee's thought was that that's perhaps even more important than at this level, that if you get the right leaders in your own home medical staff associations through a process that everyone feels is effective and fair, that goes a long way to making the organization stronger. So I would suggest, the committee would suggest that you use this process and template if it seems that it would work for you, modified, of course, within your own medical staff associations. Finally, they did spend a bit of time on what they've called an attribute matrix. And we won't go into it in detail. This is going to be passed on to the Legend Policy Committee for consideration. But what they've suggested is that in identifying the best candidates, some standard matrix should be used that can guide the committee in making its decisions. So there was first a thought, there needs to be a sort of a floor, so to speak, says candidates coming forward should at least be willing to serve, be in good standing within the SMA, as well as having values and that align with the SMA and of considered to be of good professional and ethical standing. So those are subjective, some of those, but the thought was that those were ideas of what ought to be the initial considerations. Then there are two basic components to the matrix. First is representativeness. And there's a laundry list you'll have seen in the matrix, but it includes where you come from, what you do, what specialty you're in, are you an academic, how are you paid, and those standard ones, male, female, etc. But it would also include ethnicity, sexual orientation. So there's a laundry list, there's a long list, and it will be left to the nominating and appointment committee with guidance from the board to weigh the relative importance of those things. So for example, on the board of directors, where you're wanting a mix, the diversity becomes fairly important. You wouldn't want 12 female general surgeons from Regina as your board of directors. You want a variety of folks. And so you want, and so in bringing forward the slate for the board, there may be a fair bit of consideration of representativeness. Alternatively, when you're looking for someone, let's say on the finance committee, competency becomes perhaps more significant. And whether you're male or female or rural or urban is less significant. And so there are 4 suggested competencies. These, when you would, when they would be seeking volunteers to be willing to stand, when you fill out the little bio, you'd also be asked to self-identify your sense of your competency and whichever attributes you wish to share, male, female, rural, urban, etc. And that information the committee would use. So the suggestion is to start with this attribute matrix as a starting point, and for the committee to adapt it to along with the board and finally the RA's approval to identify the issues you think most important in selecting your leaders, but to have a little more objective process to do that. So there's a resolution in regard to the use of that matrix.
Resolution 22. Be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to the proposed draft attributes matrix, document 5, be approved. And this is moved by Dr. Stoneham and seconded by Dr. Apondo. And we'll open up discussion of this motion. Seeing no discussion, we will call the question. I'll have the polling open, please. Polling is open. Polling is now closed. May we see the results? This motion is carried.
Thank you. Finally, on the stage 2 work, the committee did observe that it didn't seem right that the nominating committee also goes out and looks for candidates to replace itself. And so there was a bit of brainstorming of, well, what do you do about that? And interestingly, we couldn't find any models that addressed that very well. But the committee did recommend that rather than use the nominating committee to do that, that the Speaker of the Representative Assembly would serve in that capacity, but not in a way that they would actually apply the attribute matrix, but in a passive way. So it would be the Speaker's responsibility to passively encourage with an email to all of the RA delegates to consider nominating themselves for the NNA committee. And then that slate. So if there were 3 positions or 2 positions for election and 6 of you self-nominated, the Speaker would simply present the 6 nominees with that background information, but wouldn't do any filtering, would not influence that process, but just assure that there was candidates to come forward. There would also be the option for candidates to come forward for election at the RA itself. And the whole slate would be presented rather than the idea of the nominating committee as an expert group suggesting a preferred candidate. So that's the process they're suggesting for specifically the election of the NNA committee members. So there's a resolution for that as well.
Resolution 23, be it resolved that the recommendation of the Special Committee on SMA Governance pertaining to the proposed process for nomination and election of nomination and appointment committee members, document 2, be approved. This is moved by Dr. Pillay and seconded by Dr. Apondo. I'd like to open up any discussion on this motion. Like to call the question? Have 30 seconds to vote. Can we open the polling? The polling is closed. May we see the results? That motion is carried.
Thank you. Finally, and the good news is we're close to the end, and my apologies, we've gone over time. I appreciate your consideration. They were also tasked, the committee, with looking at those bylaw amendments the board had proposed that were predominantly precipitated by the new medical staff associations and a bit of cleanup. They have looked at them, and in 4 sections, the specific changes, bylaws regarding medical staff associations, some changes to make the bylaws more clear, a couple of spots where it was thought that would be better to try and align the current bylaws with what current practice is, and some housekeeping tune-up as well. So they've gone through those, and in general, the committee was quite supportive of almost all of the recommendations that the board had brought forward and had very few suggested changes. And I'm going to very quickly highlight a couple, because this is all now going to go to the Legislative and Policy Committee, and they will spend much more time looking at them in detail and be bringing them to you at the spring and to the annual general meeting in the spring for final approval. So there'll be 6 months to digest this. But they supported the suggested changes of the RA establishing the medical staff associations, that the medical staff associations would have boundaries that are coterminous with the health authority, and that the couple of changes to their constitution, providing financial statements and budgets to the SMA, continuing with conjoint membership dues, and that slight amendment that you've already approved to the rep by pop formula. For clarity, the suggestion that they should actually define what in good standing means. It's referenced a couple times in the bylaws that you can be a delegate if you're in good standing, you can vote if you're in good standing. The suggestion was the SMA should define what they mean by that. And so that'll be work for the committee to do in the coming months. In aligning with practice, a couple of minor changes as to who can call special meetings. They did think that we should retain the reference to the Leg and Policy Committee. And as some of you might recall, one of the problems that arose was there wasn't a standing committee when the bylaws came forward last spring, and the bylaws require a committee to look at them. They thought that that should still continue to be referenced, and the SMA board has since appointed a Leg and Policy Committee. And these recommendations will be all forwarded with your acknowledgement or support to the Leg and Policy Committee. So the next steps would be for the special committee and their documents to be passed over to the Leg and Policy Committee. That committee may want to meet with the special committee as well, perhaps at least once. And then that committee, the Leg and Policy, will review it and bring those forward to the next spring RA. And that's really the proposed roadmap between now and the spring. And then the task of implementation of the committee's recommendations. And given the support that you've offered today for the recommendations, it appears that most, if not all of them, will be able to proceed with bylaw changes that are required, and with the approval of this RA at the spring, then with final implementation. I'd stop for a minute to see if there are, I know the time is awful short, but if there are any other questions or comments, I'm sure the committee would be pleased to hear them. And if not, I want to personally thank the committee. It was one of the hardest working committees I've been on for a long time, and they met frequently and were incredibly engaged with an awful lot of interesting and thoughtful discussion. I think the committee feels this way. I personally do, that you now have in a set of documents a roadmap for success, and that you do have an outline of policies and procedures, as well as a governance structure that, at least in our opinion, might stand the organization, one would hope, maybe for success for another 50 years. And I think they're fairly confident it will do that. So I want to thank the committee as well for their work, and thank you for your thoughtful input over the last year and a half, really. So with that, we'll conclude.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As we're waiting for a change over here, I'll just remind all delegates that you have to check in with somebody at the SMA RA registration desk just so that they know that you're here if you're going to get paid for today. So if you didn't look in the eyes of somebody from the SMA RA, that might be a good thing to do to let them know that you're here today.